Oh, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Towers of Faith. We reconvene this evening with my dear friend, Father Sam McNally-Cross, who is vicar of St Thomas in Kensal Town. I keep calling it Kensal Rise for some reason. It's Kensal Town. I've got it right this time, Father, in the Diocese of London. He completed his master's degree on Christian spirituality with Heythrop College, which focused on the monastic and spiritual life and the subjective life of Thomas Merton. Father Sam has a real passion for this Trappist monk, spiritual writer, prophetic mystic, and he very much in the 1960s peeled back the veil of monastic life and really was responsible for a huge blossoming in vocation. And so without any further ado, I am going to hand you over to Father Sam, who will probably tell you a little bit more than I just did.
Thank you very much, Father. I'm just going to share my screen. Most of what's on this slideshow is pictures, just to go along with otherwise me just chatting to you. So there we are, Thomas Merton, mystic, writer and monk. So of course we need to begin with a framework for this man and the biographical information in order to build a picture of who this extraordinary person is. But for each person, and perhaps especially for Thomas Merton, the great depth can only be understood when we consider not just the details of their life, but the details of their Christian journey in particular, and also the profound impact that he has had on many people, as Father Matthew mentioned, an impact that has continued to this day and continues long, hopefully, into the future as well. So Thomas Merton was born in 1915, and I thought the best person to introduce him would be himself. And these words here from Elected Silence, or from what later became known as the Seven-Storey Mountain, his autobiography. On the last day of January 1915, under the sign of the water-bearer, in the year of a great war, and down in the shadow of some French mountains on the borders of Spain, I came into the world. In these opening words of that autobiography, we are introduced to our first glimpse of this man. Grandiose in his writing, perhaps with a touch of pomposity, but clearly a hyper-awareness of the world around him. Merton's parents, Owen and Ruth, were a New Zealander and an American, respectively. They were both artists who had met at art school in Paris, and they were married here in London in St Anne's Church in Soho. They returned to France shortly afterwards, where Owen spent most of his time painting landscapes. And Merton was baptized as an Anglican in accordance with his father's wishes. His mother was a Quaker who held no strong feelings either way on how he should be brought up in terms of his religious belief. War broke out and drove the family from France, so they returned to the safety of America to live with Ruth Merton's parents. And then his brother John Paul was born in 1918. You can see Owen and Ruth down at the bottom there, outside a bakery in France. And on the bottom corner there is one of Owen's landscapes. And he was a relatively successful landscape painter in his own right. And you can find pictures of his in galleries all over the place. So John Paul was born. There he is. So there's Thomas Merton and John Paul at the top as small children. John Paul, the younger one, on the left, Thomas Merton on the right. And then a picture on the left of John Paul Merton. You can see that sort of trademark Merton forehead and face in him there, and that's in his uniform for Second World War. The family had considered returning to France as war abated, but Ruth fell ill and was diagnosed, sadly, with aggressive stomach cancer, and then she died in 1921 when Thomas was 6 years old. Without wishing to get too bogged down in all of his biographical details, I shall race through some of the next parts before we look at his early connections with faith. Age 11, he was enrolled in a boarding school in southern France while Owen was in the country working on landscapes. He didn't attend the Mass at this Catholic school, and neither did he pay much attention to the Protestant minister that was invited in every so often to give instruction to the non-Catholic boys. And in 1928, he and his father returned to England, and Thomas attended the Anglican prep school of Oakham in Rutland, which is that picture in the bottom corner there. And it's the place where to this day the English Thomas Merton Conference is still held. Then his life changed dramatically in 1931 at the start of term when his father died, rather unexpectedly. Merton at this point was placed under the legal guardianship of one of his father's lifelong friends, Tom Bennett, who allowed him quite a lot of freedom, including the use of a house in London during the holidays. Merton himself nearly died in 1932 while he was walking in Germany, and an infected toenail that he left untreated gave him blood poisoning. Perhaps unusually, and for people unsure about faith, even in darkest moments, he didn't turn to God. About the latter experience, Merton wrote, "The thought of God, the thought of prayer did not once enter my mind, either that day or all the rest of the time that I was ill, or that whole year. Or if the thought did come to me, it was only as an occasion for its denial and rejection." Merton was quite proud of his personal creed, which was, "I believe nothing." Merton is very much a man of contradiction. He went to Cambridge, which matched his intelligence, and there is a photo. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the photo that I meant to find for this one, but this is him. This is a snapshot of it in the top right corner here. This is Merton at Cambridge, and if you pan out from this photograph, all of his classmates are looking at the camera, and Merton is the only person in the photograph whose eyes are somewhere else. A sign, perhaps, of his never really truly fitting in. A bit later on, he found communism and he joined them. Then during his time with the communists, he suddenly found Catholicism, which at that point was very much in opposition, and felt that he had to follow that instead. He settled himself with the Franciscans, teaching. You can see him down there at the bottom corner in Bonaventure University as an English teacher. And he became a novice, but that felt a bit too easy for him. So that's when he discovered Gethsemane, the Trappist monastery that he would then later enter. And then as soon as he was settled in there, he wanted to become a hermit, and something that the Trappists at that point didn't have any of. And then as soon as that was granted and he was allowed his hermitage, he had the bug to go travelling and wanted to invite as many guests as he could into his hermitage. We'll come back to his contradiction a bit later, but Merton's life is punctuated by these series of moments of conversion, and there are four that I think really make him who he is. One of the later moments of conversion is commonly called Fourth and Walnut, and that has become the defining moment of Merton's life. I don't personally think it's the most important, but it does seem to be the one that is focused upon most of all. But I'd like to spend a little bit of time before we get to that moment of the times that Christ was breaking into Merton's life. He later wrote, "We are living in a world that is absolutely transparent, and God is shining through it all the time." The first moment that God really shone through on Merton was in Rome in 1933. He had gone as a tourist to the city, and he was visiting a particular church, not for mass, but because it was known for its architecture and its history. It's this one just here, the top one there, and it is the apse of the Basilica of Cosmas and Damien in the grounds of the ancient Forum. And as Merton walked into this church and saw this darkened image, he was transfixed by it. And he spent the rest of his trip especially visiting basilicas and churches. As we will discover, Merton is not a man who does anything by half measures. And so, as well as his change in itinerary, he purchased a copy of the Vulgate and read the entire New Testament. It was during this trip that he says he really prayed, a very simple prayer, and one that we would do well to have on our lips. He simply prayed, "God, deliver me from darkness." During this trip, he also happened upon the monastery of the Three Fountains, the home of the Cistercian Trappists in Rome, which is that picture down in the bottom right corner there. And he remarked to himself on the afternoon that he stood in this courtyard, looking at this monastery, "I should be a Trappist monk." Unknown to him, in 1942, he would be making that exact same vow as a novice in a monastery of the very same order, God breaking through and bringing those moments of his life to fullness. His newfound enthusiasm for prayer and for God waned after he returned to America to visit his grandparents. He was still rather apathetic to the Catholic Church, and so he avoided attending. He tried the Episcopal Church, but he didn't like the services that he wandered into. So then he found the Quaker meetings, perhaps seeking some connection with his deceased mother, where he enjoyed the silence, but he didn't really feel like he was at home. And as we shall see through the rest of this, the place of home in the life of Merton comes up time and time again. He is a man who is perpetually restless. Secondly, Merton experienced another profound moment of union with Christ in the parish of Corpus Christi in New York, on the left-hand side there. By this point, he had left Cambridge College in England, having not studied very well. He'd fallen into a routine of heavy drinking and late nights, and he'd also gotten someone into trouble in the family way, as it is described in his book. His mentor, Tom Bennett, sent him back to America, unable to deal with the wayward Thomas Merton any longer, and he said that his grandparents instead could keep an eye on him. He was now attending Columbia University and writing and getting himself involved in the student communist movement. He had been reading Doctrine and Theology one evening, and very dramatically and very seriously he told one of his good friends that he was going to be a priest. His friend thought that he was joking and treated it all rather glibly. Then another moment of God shining through struck him. Thomas Merton writes, "I fixed my eyes on the monstrance, on the white host, and then it suddenly became clear to me that my whole life was at a crisis. Far more than I could imagine or understand or conceive was now hanging upon a word, a decision of mine. I had not shaped my life to this situation. I had not been building up to this. Nothing had been further from my mind. There was, therefore, an added solemnity in the fact that I had been called here abruptly to answer a question that had been preparing, not in my mind, but in the infinite depths of an eternal providence. The way to the promised land, the land that was not like Egypt, where I persisted in living, was now thrown open again, and I instinctively sensed that it was only for a moment." The question that was hanging over him at that point was, do you really want to be a priest? And it was what changed the course of history for him, and indeed for us. Merton continued to travel often, no doubt the product of his childhood spent between continents, and also a symptom of his restless nature. On another trip, he found himself in Cuba, and the third moment of God shining through the transparency of the world was revealed to him. In his own words, "I was in the church of St. Francis at Havana. It was Sunday. Up in front, before the altar, there were rows and rows of children gathered together. I forget if they were first communicants or not, but they were children around that age. I was far in the back of the church, and I could see the heads of all those children. It came time for consecration. The priest raised the host, and then he raised the chalice. When he put the chalice down on the altar, suddenly a friar in his brown robe and white cord stood up in front of the children, and the voices of the children burst out the creed. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. The creed, but that cry of Crea in Deus, it was loud and sudden and glad and triumphant. It was a good, big shout that came from all those Cuban children, a joyous affirmation of faith. Then, as suddenly as the shout, and as definite, and 1,000 times more bright, there formed in my mind an awareness, an understanding, a realization of what had just taken place on the altar at the consecration. A realization that God made present by the words of consecration in a way that made him belong to me. This is an intense realization for Merton, and one that shapes his theological thought, especially in regards to the sacrament of the altar. His later book, The Bread of Life, delves very deeply into what is happening as the consecration occurs. But what led him to this moment was not the priest, but the vibrant and simple piety of the young children. In his autobiography, he speaks of an early childhood experience when he was staying at the home of some simple farming folk in France. His father, when he went off travelling to more far-flung places of France, would often deposit Thomas with local villagers to be looked after while he was away. And the young, petulant and intelligent Thomas was frustrated by the lack of intellectual conversation, and that they would not be drawn into debates about religion by this precocious young man. But he admired their very simple faith, the way they said their prayers before eating and gave thanks to God for working on the land. Simple piety softens hard hearts and prepares the growth of belief. We now fast forward slightly to 1958. Merton is now a priest and a monk of the Order of the Cistercians and the Trappists, as he had prophetically predicted back in 1933. And he's been at Gethsemane Abbey since 1941. And he was running errands for the monastery that day. It was a perfectly normal day. He says, in Louisville, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, in the centre of the shopping district, I was suddenly overwhelmed with a realization that I loved all those people, that they were mine and I was theirs, that we could not be alien to one another, even though we were total strangers. It was like waking from a dream of separateness, of spurious self-isolation in a special world, the world of renunciation and supposed holiness. This sense of liberation from the illusory difference was such a relief and such a joy to me that I almost laughed out loud. I have the immense joy of being man, a member of a race in which God himself became incarnate. As if the sorrows and stupidities of the human condition could overwhelm me. Now I realize what we all are. And if only everybody could realize this, but it cannot be explained. There is no way of telling people that they are all walking around, shining like the sun. This very powerful encounter with God, shining through in this way, and note the use of that word shining again, in the visuals that Merton conjures with his words, are strongly related to the natural world, no doubt the product of his time spent with God in the wilderness of the woods that surround the abbey where his little hermitage was set up. And this signalled a shift in the thinking of Merton, that escape from the world was not really possible. Merton's biographer, William H. Shannon, says that by the time of this experience in 1958, Merton had become a very different kind of monk than when he entered the monastery in 1941. Shannon writes, one of the things going on in him was a maturing realization, born of this contemplation, that it is not possible to leave the world in any real sense. He writes, there is simply no place else to go. The experience challenged the concept of separate, holy existence lived in a monastery. He experienced the glorious destiny that comes simply from being a human person and from being united with, not separated from, the rest of the human race. And it's Merton that we shall pick up with his contemplation in this next section. There's Merton outside his hermitage, newly built in Gethsemane. When he went to his hermitage, when he finally was given permission to go and live there, because of how clumsy he was, the brothers of his monastery were deeply worried about him and thought that he would cause himself some sort of mischief, that he'd burn his hermitage down using his gas stove or something of the sort. But nevertheless, he was allowed to go off and live in this place. One of the reasons that Merton became so popular before his tragic and untimely death in 1968 is the very real experiences that he recorded and he wrote about. Here was a man, thoughtful, clearly intelligent, who had lived through much grief and heartache. He had a very unsettled life, a deeply self-destructive streak, and a quite unusual route to faith. And yet he was living as a monk in one of the most traditionally austere monastic orders of the Roman Catholic Church at a time of great international, national, and ecclesiastical turmoil. In a sense, as those words were used earlier, he was peeling back the veil that surrounded monastic life and giving a very human glimpse into that mystery. Secondly, Merton is incredibly human, clearly holy, clearly flawed, a living contradiction, a living embodiment of an incarnational faith. A lot of people read Merton to this day and feel as though he has written directly about them, about the state of their soul, about the state of their spiritual life, and about the state of their relationship with God. And it's that relationship that is at the heart of Merton and his writings. But before we get to that, we must clarify what we mean by contemplation, as it is a Christian practice not exercised as much as it should be, and one that is wildly, in my experience, misunderstood. Contemplation is not merely thinking about something, even thinking about it quite purposefully or deeply, and nor is contemplative prayer simply sitting in silence or having some peaceful quiet time, although aspects of this are all related. Merton describes it powerfully like this: contemplation is the highest expression of man's intellectual and spiritual life. It is spiritual wonder. It is a spontaneous awe at the sacredness of life, of being. It is a vivid realization of the fact that life and being in us, produced from an invisible, transcendent, and infinitely abundant source. Contemplation is, above all, awareness of the reality of that source. That's taken from New Seeds of Contemplation, perhaps one of Merton's best known works on contemplation and contemplative prayer. And I was struck by that paragraph, and especially the line, spontaneous awe at the sacredness of life. Perhaps when we think about contemplation, we may think of a very disciplined approach, or a very particular gift or charism that we simply don't possess. Or maybe we think of ourselves as an extrovert, that we simply cannot attain it. In his book, Spiritual Direction and Meditation, and What is Contemplation, a very short book and a very easy read if you're interested, Merton speaks of the different forms of contemplation. And here he reminds us of the intrinsic importance of it in the life of every Christian person. He writes, "Why do we think of the gift of contemplation, infused contemplation, mystical prayer, as something essentially strange and esoteric, reserved for small class of almost unnatural beings and prohibited to everyone else? It is perhaps because we have forgotten that contemplation is the Holy Ghost acting on our souls through his gift of wisdom and understanding, with special intensity, to increase and perfect our love for him. These gifts are part of the normal equipment of Christian sanctity." The normal equipment of Christian sanctity. I think Merton here touches upon a part of the problem, is that most Christians do not see sanctity as an aim. It's often an abstract concept of something otherworldly. If you have a more Catholic faith, you are probably somewhat more used to the language in connection with the bona fide saints of the church. But how many Christians actually feel that they are called to sanctity? The call to holiness is their entire purpose for living. Merton had much to say on this, once again making it very real and almost tangible in the lives of the average person. "For me," he said, "to be a saint means to be myself. Therefore, the problem of sanctity and salvation is in fact the problem of finding out who I am and discovering my true self." And this leads us straight back into the grip of contemplation, because as creatures of the Creator, made in his image and formed by his hand and given life by his breath, it means that to orientate ourselves to our true self, to who we really are, we must orientate ourselves to him and who he really is. As Merton says, that life that proceeds from an invisible, transcendent, infinitely abundant source. Now, that is not to say that just understanding that God created humanity, understanding that from Scripture, is enough. It must be a lived reality. And the different forms of contemplation lead us into this greater depth and communion with God. Merton asserts that there is only really one sort of contemplation when the word is used in its correct and most strict sense, a mystical contemplation that he calls passive contemplation. And this is a pure gift from God, and from God alone, who infuses it into the soul. This is what we see in the likes of the great mystical saints, such as Teresa of Avila, who we celebrate tomorrow, John of the Cross, Gemma Galgani, and Mother Julian of Norwich. But we lowly mortals need not worry, because there are what is termed active contemplation, and that has become the focus of much writing, including contemplation in a world of action, and a book by Rowan Williams called Silent Action, in which the eminent former Archbishop dialogues with Merton's writing. Alas, they never got to correspond in life, because that would have been quite a conversation worth listening to. Merton describes this active contemplation thusly: One makes use of all the resources of theology and philosophy and art and music in order to focus a simple, effective gaze on God. This is making some practice, some habitual pattern, some routine that orientates oneself to God, to gaze upon him and to have him gaze back. One of the dangers of this sort of spiritual practice is that it can become very personal, very self-focused, and very internal as we begin to sit in a contemplative spirit. We must remain connected to the church, to the revelation of God in Christ and his bride, the church. And Merton is very clear about this in the focus on the liturgy. He writes, "The liturgy teaches active contemplation, above all by its rich content of theology, scriptural revelation, which it surrounds with art and music and poetry of chaste and austere power. But at the same time, the liturgy tends to bring the soul to passive and infused contemplation by the power of that great central act, the Mass in which Christ lives on in the world and in time, and by which he draws all things to himself." So our contemplative life must be focused on the central sacrament of faith, the Mass, which Christ instituted at the Last Supper and which the Church remembers and offers across the world daily. Regular and proper participation in this great prayer of the Church is the most sure way to build that truly contemplative life. And for Merton, that is key. Contemplation is not about a particular activity, but about a life that is solely focused upon God. That is why it is easier for a monk or a nun or a hermit to enter into the gift of contemplation, because they are not of the world in the same way. But those of us who exercise our Christian life outside the cloister or cell, we have a duty from baptism to realize the gift given to us also, to keep this ordinary tool for sanctity sharpened and in good order. In that previous quotation, another term of contemplation has popped up, infused contemplation. So now we have collected 3 different expressions around this form of spiritual life, which is not bad, considering Merton himself says there's only one. Infused contemplation is the ideal that we should be striving for. We, as in those who have not received the solely God-given gift of passive contemplation. Infused contemplation is a life of contemplation that is well lived. Merton writes, "Mystical contemplation is an intuition of God or of pure love. It is a gift of God that absolutely transcends the natural capacities of the soul, and which no man can acquire by any effort of his own. But God gives it to the soul in proportion as it is clean and emptied of all affections for things outside of himself. In other words, it is God manifesting himself according to the promise of Christ to those who love him." It is fortuitous to think, as we come towards Advent, a time of preparation, a time to give our house a spiritual clean and turn our minds back towards God, to shake up our habits and to change our discipline, that we keep this in mind, that we are not earning it, but what we are in doing in some ways is making space for it. This is why silent prayer is an important part. In Scripture, we have those beautiful words from 1 Kings to Elijah, that God was not in the earthquake, God was not in the whirlwind, God was not in the fire, but in the gentle whisper, in the still, small voice. We cannot hear that if we are frantically busy or shouting in our minds. We can't hear him who gently calls us. So silence is vital for contemplation, but it shouldn't be mistaken for it. We can hear God in silence, and in silence we can face him. But one of the reasons that silence becomes uncomfortable, and therefore contemplative prayer is not well practiced, is what else we may find in that silence. Merton writes, "We are constantly in movement, always busy, meeting the demands of our social role, passively carried along on the stream of talk in which people mill around from morning to night. We are perhaps able to escape from our deeper self and from the questions it poses. We can be more or less content with the external identity, the social self, which is produced by our interaction with others in the wheeling and dealing of everyday life. But no matter how honest and open we may be in our relations with others, this social self implies a necessary element of artifice. It is always, to some extent, a mask. It has to be. But do we ever give ourselves the chance to realize that this talkative, smiling, perhaps rough and ready personage that we seem to be is not necessarily our real self? Do we ever give ourselves a chance to recognize something deeper when we are quiet, not just for a few minutes, but for an hour or several hours? We may become uneasily aware of the presence within us of a disturbing stranger, that self that is both I and someone else. And this is part of the issue of our fallen human condition. We don't want to shake that fragile grip we have on God and faith by coming face to face with the true self and receiving the revelation that our exterior self is somehow lacking. Merton goes on, if we are afraid of being alone, afraid of silence, it is perhaps because of our secret despair of inner reconciliation. If we have no hope of being at peace with ourselves, in our own personal loneliness and silence, we will never be able to face ourselves at all. We will keep running and never stop. And this flight from self is, as the Swiss philosopher Max Picard pointed out, a flight from God. For Merton, contemplation is a perfection of perfect charity, of perfect love. In order that we might come entirely to God and fully into his presence, we must perfect our love for him and the work that must be done in the inner self. Merton was interested in the spirituality of the Carthusian monastic order, even more austere than the Cistercians. They don't operate under the rule of St Benedict or any form of Benedictine order like the Trappists may do, which Merton was, but under their own rule of their founder, which has been unchanged since the 1100s. The Carthusians operate a system of enclosures. Their main enclosure is the monastery to protect them from the outside world. Then the solemnly professed brothers have another internal cloister. Then they have their own private cells that no one can enter except in extremis. And finally, rather poignantly, they have the cell of the heart, the ground where only they and God may tread and meet. When Merton was in his own hermitage, he reflected something of this charism and desire for solitude with God. Some of his journal entries on silence reflect this. On March the 19th, 1948, God hidden with me. I find him by hiding in the silence in which he is concealed. February 13th, 1949. It seems to me that what I am made for is not speculation, but silence and emptiness, to wait in darkness and to receive the word of God entirely in his oneness and not broken up into all his shadows. And in May 15th, 1949, I am confronted by the fact of my past prayer, acts, thoughts, desires, words became inadequate when I was a novice. Resting in God, sleeping, so to speak, in his silence, remaining in his darkness, have fed me and made me grow for 7 years. There is clearly then a need for silence in the pursuit of a contemplative life. And indeed, not just to develop contemplation, but to truly live. Arguably for Merton, that is one and the same thing. A life well lived is a contemplative life. He writes in The Silent Life, the world of men has forgotten the joys of silence, the peace of solitude, which is necessary to some extent for the fullness of human living. Not all men are called to be hermits, but all men need enough silence and solitude in their lives to enable the deep inner voice of their own true self to be heard at least occasionally. When that inner voice is not heard, when man cannot attain the spiritual peace that comes from being perfectly at one with his own true self, his life is always miserable and exhausting, for he cannot go on happily for long unless he is in contact with the springs of spiritual life, which are hidden in the depths of his own soul. If man is constantly exiled from his own home, locked out of his own spiritual solitude, he ceases to be a true person. He no longer lives as a man. He becomes a kind of automaton, living without joy, because he has lost his spontaneity. He is no longer moved from within, but only from outside himself. I think that we see this in our current world, in the rise in popularity of meditation and yoga and mindfulness, that people are seeking something to align themselves to, seeking something to peer into themselves and to become comfortable in their own skin, when they are constantly being bombarded by the messages of media, work, social convention, that they need to be acting, thinking, or being a certain way. They're always moved from the outside, as Merton says. In his interaction with the Eastern religions, especially with Buddhism, Merton encountered this inner solitude in a way that was nearly but all lost to our Western church. It is a great shame that when people think of meditation and contemplation, they turn first to these Eastern practices rather than to their own church on their doorstep. We, brothers and sisters, have forgotten how to meet God within ourselves, and therefore we have neglected to teach that. Perhaps another reason for the popularity of Merton is because there is a hunger for spiritual communion with God. And Merton opens the door and gives permission to find it in your parish church rather than your local Buddhist temple. The silence that Merton describes is one that allows individuals to enter into the greater sense of awareness of themselves, of their surroundings, and therefore of God. The relationship between creation, experienced in the silence, and God, the Creator, is a key aspect of this. It is about increasing the harmony between creation and Creator, between us as part of that creation, but the ones that with the privileges that God has placed upon us. It is the perfecting of Christian charity. To love God is to love all that he has made. Merton experienced this in the natural beauty of his surroundings in the woods of Kentucky, and also it was the fruit of the contemplative life that he had been living when he had his fourth and walnut conversion. In his journals around the time that he was in his hermitage, he was evangelical about silence, and he experienced it, writing in May 1965, "The silence of the forest is my bride, and the sweet dark warmth of the whole world is my love. And out of the heart of the dark warmth comes the secret that is heard only in silence, but it is the root of all the secrets that are whispered by all the lovers in their beds all over the world. The silence of the forest is his bride." We, as Christians, Merton is saying, must enter into a relationship with silence that we would, as we would with a spouse, to love it, to want to be with it, to experience it fully. And like taking a spouse, that means that we have to make something of a sacrifice. The single man or woman can act as they choose on their own whim. They have no dependents or others that need to be considered in their action. The married man or woman is now attached to the other in a bond that means that a large part of their choices and decisions are made in conjunction with another. In silence, we give up part of our external self in order to discover our true self. We must give up our attachment to the world in order to progress to heaven. Part of the reason that silence is so uncomfortable for many people is because of the ego, the very human desire to control all things, the very need to be the one to do, to think, and to say. Merton, a man of huge intellectual gift and curiosity, one who would write reams in response to questions he was asked, who wrestled internally with loving the prominence of his writing that had brought him the need for solitude, summarized the whole thing with one simple line, written on December the 16th in 1966. "From the silence of the valley, I could learn that certain questions do not need answers of mine." They do not need answers of ours because in silence we find truth, the ultimate truth of God. Thank you very much.
Well, Father Sam, thank you very, very much for that. What an incredible walk through the life of Thomas Merton. I don't think I'd, despite the fact that that I see the impact that he has in your life on a day-to-day basis, I don't think I quite grasped how big an impact he'd had right across the church. He's a very attractive figure for me especially when people describe him as controversial and pompous. I suddenly find myself strangely attracted to the man. And I love the way you described his trademark forehead. I mean, that's a thing now trademarked, isn't it? Your forehead. And I was pleased early on in the presentation to see a sign there that said, Merton had a sudden insight in this corner. And when I leave my church here, I'm going to have a plaque installed with the same words. Father Matthew had a sudden insight in this corner. But I don't think I'll be able to get across his understanding of contemplative prayer. It's something I've always struggled with. And to hear you tease out that it's not about being silent, it's not about a lot of that stuff. It's about passive contemplation and attempting to grasp and understand the difficulty of silence. And it's perhaps in that, in trying to grasp the difficulty of silence and listening to that small voice, that perhaps we start to be able to enter and understand what contemplative prayer is about. I was very glad to hear you say that one of the things he said was, thank goodness that all men are not called to be hermits. That's a deeply reassuring line. Very irritably though, Father, I have a bone to pick with you in this, because whilst you did that, I came up with at least 4 books.
Sorry.
That I need.
Well, if it's any consolation, I probably have all of them, so you can read them from here, rather than annoy your wife by buying them.
What books? So there we go. Let's throw open the floor now for questions. We are joined by such a wonderful array of people. So questions. I'm looking at you all. You can raise a digital hand or you can wave at me. Kevin, you'll need to just unmute yourself there, Kevin.
Hi.
There we go. We can hear you.
Sorry, just struggling with the technology there. I was very much drawn into what you were saying about that wee small voice and entering into that realm of silence in which we might hear where God is leading us and where Christ is inviting us to tread. I just wondered whether there was a danger in doing that we might become too disconnected from the world around us and from that invitation that we read about in the New Testament to proclaim the word of Christ and the good news that Christ brought to us to the wider world, and whether there was a juxtaposition between those two which was a difficult thing to balance, and what Merton might have to say about that.
Yes, I think that is one of the continual stumbling blocks for this. Are we called to be contemplative in the place in which we can find God most closely, or are we called to live out the gospel in an active way? And he does cover a lot of this in great detail in the book, A Contemplative in the World of Action, which is quite a hefty tome, which he can go into. He goes into more detail about how you manage to balance these things. For him, it was about establishing patterns and connections and routines. So even though he was a hermit and he was spending time in his hermitage seeking God single-mindedly, he would still, I think it was 2.5 or so miles from the abbey, he would still go down there every morning for morning prayer. He'd still go back every evening for evening services and be with his brothers in that way as well. So although he was separating himself for large periods of time, and through his writing and that sort of thing, he would still maintain his connection with his brothers and therefore with the world that came into Gethsemane, largely because of him. Gethsemane became incredibly busy as an abbey because people came to see Merton and follow him. So the novices program exploded, the guests wanting to stay there exploded, and rather ironically, his writing and his desire to seek God in silence made the abbey much noisier, which is why he sought his time away. But he did maintain his connection that way. There's a remarkable story about a Belgian Carthusian monk who had been in silence for many years, and he'd reached a great age, and sort of almost without any precedent really. He was interviewed by a journalist who asked how he dealt with some of the sort of the big things of the world while he was in his cell, and they asked him about the war, and he started speaking about World War One, and they said no, the Second World War, and his reply was, what Second World War? He'd lived in his cell for so long, and the abbot or the prior of they don't have abbots. The prior of that was the person with connection to the outside world with a radio. And when war broke out, he decided not to tell them. He didn't think it was a big enough deal. And so this chap had grown up in his cell without any knowledge of the Second World War. And people sort of say, well, how can you possibly be praying for the world when you don't know what's going on in the world? But they would, the Carthusians particularly would say, their faithful prayer, their witness is what is showing God to the world. But yeah, that tension between active and contemplative is one that I think is always going to rear its head, and you will find very strong advocates on both sides.
But it's possibly not showing God to the world if the world cannot see it.
No, they would say their example is that they do this, and that people know of them, and that their hidden life is the witness. So they're sort of hiding it in plain sight, if that makes sense. If you go onto their website, it quite ferociously says, "Our liturgy is not for you; it's for God." Yes, they're quite different to a lot of the other monastic orders who have a sort of more welcoming, hospitable way of inviting people in. But they uninterrupted in their liturgy pray for the church and the world and let God deal with the rest.
Well, it's an interesting insight, and thank you for your answer.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you for the question, Kevin. We have a question from Father Alex in the group chat, but Father, why don't you ask that directly?
Yeah, just a strange thought that, and when we know him so well as Thomas Merton, but of course the majority of his writing and the work that we have of him was when he was Father Louis. Why? Just a mundane question. Why it's so unusual for a religious to write with their secular name? Why has his religious name fallen out, if you like?
That's a very good question. I think it's largely because he was already a published writer before he entered Gethsemane, and so it was probably when he wrote his autobiography, the one that sort of really made his name. I think if it approached under his religious name, they probably would have said no, because they wouldn't have had any knowledge of who he was, or why this novice should be writing a book about the monastic life. But using some of his previous credentials and publishing contacts that way is probably what then endured. And I think from that was the one, that was the bestseller, that sold all over the world. And I think then afterwards they just continued. And I think also for him there was always a tension in his life between what he perceived to be his monastic calling and writing. When he first entered Gethsemane, he gave a lot of his letters to someone and said, burn these. I don't want them anymore. I don't want anything of my writing prior to my monastic life being around. Thankfully, that person didn't burn them, so we still have a lot of it. But he did burn some of his stuff himself as well. And so I think he always felt this slight tension between being a very prominent writer and being called to live a life in a cloister. One of his great critics said that Thomas Merton was the sort of man who would want to live in Times Square in a hermitage with a big neon sign that says hermit. And so I think he kind of had this, so I'm speculating slightly, but maybe for him there was something that he could, when he was in his hermitage, praying, he could be Father Louis, and when he was at his typewriter furiously typing, he could be Thomas Merton. And there was perhaps some kind of compartmentalization going on to help alleviate some of that tension. But I think probably it's a practical thing that some of his pre-monastic work was under his secular name.
Thank you, Father. I see that Mark Bryant has his digital hand up. So Mark, we'll come to you next.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Father. I wonder if you could say something a bit more about how Merton's understanding of contemplation leads to his political stance. So, for example, his quite strong involvement with the anti-Vietnam War movement. I mean, how do you understand that emerging out of his understanding of contemplation?
Yes, yeah. So he was, as you say, was very heavily involved with the anti-war groups, and actually, particularly the Berrigan brothers, who were influenced by him, and he by them, I think. And I think particularly his relationship with Daniel Berrigan was quite telling. I think he almost kind of comes across as the fuel for the fire of Berrigan's action, and so I think he kind of sees himself kind of working in tandem with them, and so therefore he becomes quite annoyed when Berrigan does things like burn his call-up card and that sort of thing, because he says that's an act of violence that he can't participate in. And I think it was this sort of revelation where everybody is shining like the sun. I think that really changed his perception of the world, and that he wasn't escaping it; he was taking it with him. And therefore, to take it with him and to sanctify it, it needed to be protected and preserved and brought with him into that. And so anything that was going to put pay to God's creation or to human life was going to be incredibly disconnected from that view of God being in all and of all. So I think he was quite happy to sort of be the sort of prayerful, prophetic voice that inspired the movement to an extent, until they went, in his mind, too far. I think he saw his role as not as a participant in that way, but as a sort of like the engine room, really.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Let's take a question now from Father Gustav.
Thank you, Father. Apologies for my question, because I'm writing a paper on canon law, so I'm fixed in his church politics. And one thing with Thomas Merton is that he was quite controversial. He was one of the first non-Franciscans that was engaged in interreligious relations. And he's still, in his own church community, quite controversial. There are those that wouldn't touch him because of his relationship with the Buddhist spirituality, for instance. And how was he? How did he reflect on those things? Because he must have been aware of that, especially during the Second Vatican Council period, and all this is in turmoil already.
Yes, I mean he was quite insightful in that he wrote in a letter to Ernesto Cardinal that he knows full well that his reputation in Rome has been irreparably damaged, and because of the people who were opposed to him. And I think that is true. I think there are still a lot of Catholics who are deeply suspicious of Thomas Merton. One of the things that is spoken of him quite often is that God took him because he was on his way out. He was on his way to become a Buddhist rather than remain as a Christian. From reading his diaries, I don't get any sense of that at all. He was so deeply wedded to the Eucharist that I don't think he'd have been content anywhere he couldn't experience that. And I think for him, the most important thing was this exploration of silence. And he he cast his net very wide, I think, because he knew where harbour was, he knew where home was, and he knew he'd always come back to home, which allowed him to go deeper than most people were prepared to, and indeed more than most people could understand. He was very frustrated a lot of the time with the again, struggling to want to do the things that he felt that he was called to do, and also living as a man under obedience. They silenced him. The bishops in America silenced him when he wanted to write more about the war. He wrote the autobiography because he was told to. And so there was, again, that constant tension in his life of these things coming up against each other. And yeah, I think he was very, very self-destructive, and I think he dwelt on these things a lot, and what people thought of him meant a great deal to him, perhaps more than he would have liked to admit. For example, when the first PhD was written about Thomas Merton's writings, he was still alive and he read it. And partly being delighted by being the subject of someone's doctoral studies, his main comment in the return was, it strikes me, I've always written far too much, far too soon. And so, he was a deeply critical, self-critical person. And so I think he was quite wounded by a lot of the negativity that he attracted. But then largely, that was a lot of it was his own making as well. So again, that self-destructive streak that caused people to criticize him, then caused him to dwell on that criticism and I think become quite affected by it. So I think some of his diary entries are just quite sad, and there are moments in it where clearly the emotion is high, and he writes and you can tell, because normally he writes huge long sentences with lots of words, and then all of a sudden you'll get little short words like, the abbot told me I couldn't do this today, full stop. And you can tell from those moments that actually there is something going on there, and he's not himself. And like any of us, when we're in that sort of mood, we don't want to have those long conversations. But I think he did dismantle himself a lot about a lot of that, really.
Yeah, I mean, this has probably stopped him from the canonization he should have had. I mean, if you look at his life, it's quite like Padre Pio's, except for the I can't remember the English word now. Christ's wounds in the background from coming into the monastic life, and it's quite similar, and it's quite amazing how the impact Thomas Merton has on us all in the whole Western Church.
Yeah, I mean, I think his reputation has been quite severely damaged. I don't think he'll ever become a saint in a bona fide sense by the Catholic Church. I think he's far too controversial for that. I mean, it was very telling when the Pope was visited America and quoted him, and for some that was a great kind of recognition of Merton's orthodoxy. But then obviously the Pope, being quite controversial as a character in his own right, those who already thought Merton was a suspect found him even more dodgy. So it's depending on where you sit and what you want to hear, you'll hear whatever you want. And so if he's quoted by the Pope, it depends which Pope. So I think he's a very difficult man he's a very difficult man to unpick, really, and perhaps we're not supposed to. And actually, maybe a lot of his life is lived on the fringes of things, and perhaps that's the best place for him. Not to be taken into the realm of bona fide saint, but to live slightly on the edge and be that slightly kind of prickly, controversial contrarian, to help those of us who feel very similar to be led on that same path.
I was going to say, Father, I can't imagine what it is that drew you to him. Thank you, Father Gustav. We have a question from Andy McQueen next.
Thank you, Father, for your fascinating talk. I've jotted a phrase down, and I'm not sure whether it's Merton's own words or your own synopsis. Silence is vital for contemplation, but not to be mistaken for it. I don't know whether you claim that for yourself or for your subject.
That was my synopsis, but it's largely what he would say. Yeah. I think that it's a vital part of it, but not it can't be mistaken for it.
I just wonder what he might say to those of us who would be contemplative prayers, who place ourselves in conditions of silence. Is silence is essentially something we establish for ourselves, and the contemplative prayer is ultimately the gracious gift of God. But that journey, that invitation, laying ourselves open, tuning in, the various analogies that he used. I just wonder how he might develop that.
Yes.
Shift.
Yeah. I mean, he was very open about the fact that actually for people who were leading a cloistered life, this is easier. He said that, and I think if you talk to lots of religious today, they will say that actually it's easier to live a Christian life in a monastery. The hard work is actually done in the world, and Merton agreed with that entirely. He was very much it was easy for him in his hermitage to sit in silence. He knew that when he spoke to people like the Berrigan brothers or the priests that came to the Gethsemane for retreats and things, that actually their life was the hardest point of balance between silence and contemplation. And I think he really sort of hammers home the importance of routine and structure. That was very important to ensure that he was making time to do that. That he would pray at particular times. He'd get up at these are the same. He was still governed by the monastic schedule, even when he was living alone. And that, I think, is an important way for us to try and carve out that time in our own life, and to keep coming back to the corporate life of prayer in the church. And he didn't separate his contemplation from that. He still maintained contact with his brothers in that sense, and wanted to be and needed to be involved in the celebration of the Mass and such like. Not just when he did it privately on his own in his hermitage as permitted to do so, but when he gathered in the monastery itself. And so I think when anyone, I think as Father Matthew rightly pointed out, not everyone is called to be a hermit, and I think actually the hermit life can only come at a point when your spiritual life is robust enough to deal with that. It's certainly not the nursery in which you learn your spiritual faith. That's amongst your brothers and sisters in church, and then as you delve more deeply into that, that's when you need more silence. And then I think he would also talk about the cultivation of silence within, and so that it doesn't necessarily, that you should be working towards a point where it doesn't matter if the place you're in is noisy, because the silence and the stillness comes from your own sense of attachment to that, or disattachment to it. So you can learn to be silent in a city. Obviously, it's harder, but you can do so, and that's the aim, really, that you're moving towards that sort of infused place where you can just enter into that point through gift, but because you've cleared the space for that gift to be received.
Thank you.
Okay, I see no other digital hands, so I'm going to give you all an opportunity to wave at me if you have a question now. Wow, oh, good grief. Father Alex, back to you, lovely. Oh, you're waving at me just to say hello.
No, I actually have a question. You see, this is good. You see, if you don't force me into it, I have questions. I just suicide or not.
Yes, I mean, well, the sort of there's three major theories around his untimely death: accident, suicide, or murder. I read a book fairly recently on about called The Martyrdom of Thomas Merton, and indeed met one of the authors. I have to say I wasn't particularly convinced that it was a state orchestrated murder. I don't think it was suicide, just because of the consistency of his thought, and I think I mean, if he was prepared to disassociate himself from Daniel Berrigan over the burning of a warrant card, that's not consistent with someone who feels that it would then be he would be able to take his own life. I think it was probably just a tragic accident, and yeah, I think that's where I come to. I mean, he was self-destructive, but I don't think he was that self-destructive.
And I hadn't realised until you'd said that he was extremely clumsy.
Hugely.
So I guess somebody who's clumsy who decides to, I think it was, balance an electric fan on the end of a...
The official story is that he had finished giving a presentation when he was at a conference, and he went off to have a shower in between because it was very hot, and he got out of the shower, slipped and placed his hand on an electric fan, which was badly wired, and died as a result of electrocution. But I don't think we really know. Ultimately, something clearly happened, and he died. But
there's clearly some controversy around it, Father. If you don't mind me speaking across you, because of all the lectures we've done so far on Towers of Faith, this is the only one that has attracted a number of emails from people saying, "I do hope you cover this conspiracy theory, and I do hope you're going to talk about that conspiracy theory." And we've not had that for anybody else. So he clearly is a figure who attracts a degree of controversial thought even after death.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is sort of in some way testament to his pulling power, really. That yeah, I mean, he is one of those characters that there'd be perfectly good reasons for him to be silenced. The church did silence him a lot, but he was clearly not popular amongst the politicians who were trying to advance the Vietnam War, and people have been killed for less. So I can completely understand where they come from. I don't think that was the case. I don't think the CIA were bothered with but then again, having said that, he was incredibly influential, and people knew that Americans were reading his books in vast number, and if you put his name on something, people would read it. So yeah, there are all sorts of theories and conspiracy theories about it. I don't think we'll ever really know the full extent of it, but
Father, in terms of his his potential for canonization and so forth, he's not the most controversial figure in the history of the church.
No.
And so to put down that he was controversial as a reason for his canonization not moving forward or even being discussed, do you think this is really something about time and distance from the events of the day?
Very possibly. I mean, one of the major controversies around Merton is whether he physically broke his monastic vows or not. He writes quite openly about falling in love with a nurse when he was in his later years, while he was being treated, and he writes sort of poetically, which could evidence that actually he had a sexual relationship with her. Other people have read that as symbolic, or as almost like Song of Songs type of language, and so that's a potential issue. If that, and I think because there's no clear answer on that, that's problematic for any kind of promotion of a life of virtue and holiness. Yeah, so I think yeah, but I think it is a time when I think the force of personality was becoming quite a big thing, sort of the 50s and 60s. These names, he has been sort of quite grandly described as the sort of 20th century's Augustine in terms of his intellect, but also his wild living. I don't know how
Augustine did it before he was
exactly, yeah, So as Brother John Everett says, there are some similar stories abound about St John Paul II as well. So yeah, there are these things, but I suppose when someone has with someone like St John Paul II, there was a clear desire for him to be a saint, and so people are going to push very hard for that and work through some of the stories and things about him. I think because Thomas Merton divides people so much, there'll never be that clear 100% drive for him to be canonized.
Well, we've got some questions in the chat with people asking you what books would be best to start reading around his teaching and contemplation. Can I suggest that what we do is perhaps you could put together a short bibliography of where people could start, and we put that on the website.
Yeah, certainly.
And so we'll put that up on towersoffaith.com. This video will be available from tomorrow morning on towersoffaith.com, along with some links to a bibliography, and perhaps you could write a short piece on where people can start reading.
Certainly, very happy to.
As I commit you to a bunch of work. Okay, one last look around. Are there any more questions? No. It's been an absolute joy to be with you this evening and to hear this wonderful talk from my dear friend, Father Sam. I look forward to seeing you all again in a couple of weeks. Good night and God bless.